Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 15th lecture in our course on general psychology. So we are at the halfway point in our course, and so far we've covered some of the biological aspects of psychology, some of the history of psychology, and we've also covered a few psychological functions, so things like the senses, learning, memory. And in this unit, we're going to cover emotion and motivation. So in this unit, in this lecture, I'll talk about emotion, and next lecture I'll talk about motivation, which is a very related concept. So for this unit and this lecture in particular, we're going to be looking at emotions and theories of emotion and what we know about emotion. First, we have to define, as always, what our terms are. What are emotions? It's one of these things that we all can refer to, but it's very hard to define an emotion without referring to other emotions. It's very difficult to establish sort of a ground truth when it comes to emotions because they're very subjective. And what we're going to do today is look at how emotions uh, not just are involved in our psychology, but also how they affect and are affected by the body and the brain. And then we'll look at emotional communication. In particular, we'll look at expression. And sometimes we express emotion, sometimes we try not to express emotion. And we'll talk about how successful people are at each of those. So what we're going to do today is look in particular, at the link between our emotional experiences and physiology. That is, the way the body works. So emotions can have an impact or are related to our physiology, certain physiological measures like heart rate, like pupil diameter. Uh, so there are physiological responses to stimuli and to emotions. We'll talk about different theories of emotion and how people have thought in the past about, do emotions cause responses in our body, or does our body's response cause our feelings? We'll cover that issue as well early in this lecture. Uh, Getting to the brain, we'll learn that the amygdala in particular is important for emotion. Uh, and that the amygdala not only lets us experience emotion, in some way generates part of our emotional experience, but it is also critical in assessing emotions in others. We'll also see that we can be very expressive emotionally, particularly our facial expressions. Uh, and we're very good at conveying information, especially with our facial expressions. Uh, of course, there are times when we want not to convey the emotion we're actually feeling. We may want to tone it down, or we may want to exaggerate it, and we may want to deceive others as to what emotion we're currently experiencing. And we'll see that we're not always so good at that. There are ways to tell whether emotional expression is genuine. And people aren't generally very good at it, but it is doable. So we'll get to that at the end. So first, what is emotion? Well, as your book describes it, it is a positive or negative experience that's associated with a pattern of physiological activity. Uh, and that's a fine start. I like to add a couple things in there. First, that there are behaviors that are associated with emotions. And sometimes we can do our best to suppress those behaviors. We're not always so effective at that. Uh, but there are behaviors, outward signs, uh, that emotional states are correlated with. So it's not just an internal experience, there's also a behavioral component. And these components are to a certain degree involuntary. So whereas a lot of our cognitive processes are voluntary, we try to do them, emotions often occur whether we're trying to experience them or not. So I think both those are important things to add. But this definition is a good start because you have this valence idea. It's a positive or negative experience. It's subjective. And there's also physiological activity. So emotions are not just a cognitive experience, they are a physiological experience as well. Your book doesn't mention this, but there are different theories of emotion. Um, and one of them is what's called a categorical theory. And a categorical theory is the idea that there are separate emotions. and they are sort of compartmentalized. That we have a module, if you will, for the feeling of fear, and one for the feeling of happiness, and one for the feeling of sadness. And that these aren't very tightly related. They're all emotions, but they exist as distinct categories. So this figure on the right is from a different book that talks about this idea. And the idea here is that you have these different categories, and it can vary in terms of intensity. So you can be content, or you can be happy, or you can be ecstatic, and those are all sort of different shades of the same category. And if you've seen the Pixar movie Inside Out, uh, this is very much a depiction of this idea. In that movie, you have different characters that represent the different emotions. So these are separate entities that can interact, but are not all part of the same thing. They are fundamentally different and distinct. And so in that movie, you have anger, disgust, happiness, fear, and sadness. And those are five of the most commonly agreed upon emotions. But in this framework, they are very much separate and distinct. Your book talks about what are called dimensional theories. And so here, the idea is that emotions exist on a spectrum, that they aren't these distinct categories. And the two spectra that they occupy are what are known as arousal and valence. So arousal has a certain physiological connotation to it, but arousal deals with things like excitement. So being excited would be a high arousal state. So it deals with energetic qualities of emotions. Valence is positive or negative, generally speaking, pleasant or unpleasant. So, for example, you could have negative valence and high arousal, and this would be something like angry or afraid. These are thought to be unpleasant, but they are sort of agitated states. They're aroused states, high energy. You can have high arousal, positive valence, like excited or delighted. So these are positive, but still high energy. Then you can have positive valence, low arousal, and these are things like calm, which is calm is a pleasant state of being, but it's not high energy. In fact, it's by definition the opposite. So you can be content. That would be another positive valence, but low arousal state. Then there are negative valence, low arousal states, like depression. And this is not a psychological diagnosis. It's not depressed in the sense of a psychological disorder, uh, but depressed or sad or bored. These are negative states, but they're not high energy, they're low energy. And so this dimensional theory is just a way of putting all the emotions on some sort of common scale where they can be compared. And again, not every emotional theory has that component to it, but it's the one highlighted in your book, so I mention it here. Okay, so that is the definition of emotion, and some ways of categorizing or describing emotions. Now, part of that definition, of course, was that physiological processes are involved as well. There's a physiological role uh, in emotion. And there have been different theories about the relationship between the physiology of the body and emotional experience. So this is a diagram from your book showing some of these different theories. Before I get to that, there is what's often called the folk psychology theory of emotion, which is the idea that we have an emotional experience, and then that emotional experience dictates our body's response. The idea being that we become afraid, and then our heart rate increases, uh, our pupils dilate, we have the classic fight or flight response. And then that is sort of the folk psychological, that is the naive notion. Um, Before any research was done, this is what people thought emotions were consisted of. That you have an emotional experience, and then you have a physiological reaction caused by that emotional experience. Um, the trouble there is there are physiological responses that can precede emotional awareness. So the opposite tack was taken by two psychologists, one William James, who we've run into several times before, and the other a Danish psychologist named Carl Lang. And they came up with what was called the James Lang theory. They actually did it independently, but they were so close together in proposing the theory that it's named after both of them. And the James Lang theory is that there's some frightening stimulus, for example, and that actually causes a physiological change, and a specific one. So that physiological change in this case would be specific to fear. And then that the brain or the mind then detect that specific physiological state, and then the experience of fear is generated. In other words, you have a stimulus that drives the physiology, and that physiology then causes the emotional response. And of course, that's not perfect either, because there are, just as there are physiological responses that precede emotional awareness, there are certainly physiological changes that come after emotional awareness. Your book mentions blushing as a physiological response, and that's a good example. That takes a while. So obviously, if we waited to blush before we actually felt embarrassed, we might be waiting a while. That's not our experience. We feel embarrassed before blushing. So that was right there a problem with the James Lang theory, but it was interesting, and it did acknowledge the idea that our emotional experience is affected in some way by physiology, even if it's not entirely driven by it. Well, a second theory, called the Cannon-Bard theory, second row in this diagram, says that these things happen simultaneously, that you have both a change in physiology and the experience of fear emotionally at the same time, that these are independent processes. The problem there is that we know they're not really independent. We know one can affect the other. So folk psychology, there are problems with that order. James Lang theory, there are problems with that order. Cannon-Bard, there are problems with the fact that we know these are not totally separate processes, that physiology and emotional experience can influence one another. Finally, there's what's called the two-factor theory, sometimes called the Schachter-Singer theory, after the scientist who proposed it. And the idea here is that physiology affects our emotional experience, um, but not in a specific way, the way James and Lang proposed. That instead, you are in some general arousal state, and that alters your emotional experience. Uh, and then that was an interesting idea, and it's got some merit to it. Schachter and Singer did an interesting experiment where they had people come in to do a task, participants, and there was somebody else in the room with them doing the task. Uh, and that person, the other person, was what's called a confederate. They were in on the experiment, and they were told either to act angry or to act happy. Now, what Schachter and Singer did was they injected the real participants with adrenaline to put them in that arousal state. And their theory was that being generally aroused will give them an emotional experience, but the context of being with someone angry or happy will actually determine what emotion they feel. And that turned out to be right. So in that experiment, the participants were in that arousal state thanks to a physiological manipulation, the injection of adrenaline. But what emotion they reported was dictated, at least in part, by what the other person in the room was doing, how they were feeling. And so there's obviously this mutual influence between physiology and emotional experience. So again, there are problems with each of these things. With the James Lang theory, there's no unique physiological state for each emotion. So James Lang would suggest that you could deduce what emotion someone is feeling by measuring their physiology, and that you get a perfect mapping between all these physiological states and all the emotions. That just doesn't work. There aren't that many different physiological states for all the nuanced emotions that we experience. That being said, the trouble with the two-factor theory is there's not just one state of general arousal either, that emotions are associated with certain physiological markers, not to the high level of detail required by the James Lange theory, but heart rate changes more for things like anger than for things like disgust. And you can measure temperature in the body in this diagram from your book. Your finger temperature goes way up, relatively speaking, when someone is angry, but doesn't go up very much for happiness. So there are combinations of physiological states that are associated with different emotions. But again, the James Lange theory that our emotional experience is based on specific physiological markers is perhaps a step too far. So we have physiology, the relationship between physiology and emotion. What about the brain? Obviously, the brain is the basis for our other psychological experiences. And when it comes to emotion, the most important part of the brain is the amygdala. And the amygdala we mentioned before is part of the limbic system, as is the hippocampus. So you have two amygdalae. There's one on each side. And they're located in the temporal lobes of the brain. And they are very important for emotional experience, especially in the process that's called appraisal, which is our ability to process a stimulus and decide, not consciously, that is, but decide in some unconscious way whether that is a threatening stimulus, what sort of emotional content that stimulus has. So on the bottom of this slide, we have this diagram. And what this diagram is a comparison between normal individuals and an individual who's lost both her amygdala. And we see a measurement of their responses to scary movie clips. And so the tall bars in this diagram are the normal participants. So they report a high level of fear for a number of these different movie clips. And these are horror movies or action movies that have surprising events. However, the other bars in this diagram, the darker ones, they represent the responses of the person that lost both amygdalae. And that patient doesn't respond, does not report being scared at any point, or at least, perhaps a small degree of fear for a couple of those clips. So that is part of the process of appraisal. So deciding whether or not something is frightening or not. And this is not a common condition to be missing both amygdalae, but it is disruptive. So you might think that, oh, wouldn't it be great if you weren't afraid of anything? But fear can be useful, so it can keep us away from dangerous situations. This patient, there's been at least one occasion where she walked into a dangerous area and someone tried to mug her. So it's not great having no fear whatsoever. In her case, actually, the mugger was so put off by her not being afraid of him that he ran away. So it turned out okay. But the fact is that she would never have perhaps gone to that place, or certainly not have approached the mugger and started a conversation the way she did, if she had at least one of her amygdala intact. So the amygdala is very important for assessing situations. It's also important in fear conditioning, and that's a topic we touched on back in our unit on learning. So fear conditioning is a particular kind of classical conditioning in which a mouse or a rat is placed in a chamber. The unconditioned stimulus is an electric shock administered through the floor. The conditioned stimulus is a tone, sound. And after a while, the animal learns to associate that tone with getting a shock. And when it gets a shock, it will freeze in place. That is the animal's fear response. After a while, after conditioning, that animal will freeze in response to the sound. So it has been conditioned to associate the sound with the shock. But if the amygdala is not intact in the animal, then this does not happen. That conditioning does not occur. So the amygdala seems to be critical for certain kinds of emotionally based learning. It's also involved in what's called borderline personality disorder, which is not a topic we've gotten to yet. But borderline personality disorder is a disorder characterized by difficult social relationships. People with this disorder often have difficulty building trust with someone. Um, they are they fear being abandoned, or they fear someone else trying to cheat them in some way. They have trouble trusting other people. And it turns out the amygdalae in these individuals exhibit more activity, which is what we see in the bottom right here. In that top row, we see a relatively normal level of amygdala activity in the bottom of these brain images. In the borderline patients, we see exaggerated activity. And they're not seeing scary stimuli. Here they're looking at pictures of faces that are neutral or even happy, but they respond to them the same way they respond to faces that are afraid. And so there seems to be a difficulty with appraisal in borderline personality disorder. And it turns out stimuli out in the world uh, get processed by two different pathways that are called the fast and slow pathways. And so all sensory information, except for our sense of smell, go through the thalamus. So that is the sensory routing center. Uh, but it turns out that information can go directly from the thalamus to the amygdala, or it can go from the thalamus up to the cortex and then to the amygdala. So the fast pathway is the one that goes directly to the amygdala, of course, and the slow pathway is the one that goes to the cortex first. And this explains how you can be afraid of something before you even recognize what it is. So to recognize the object or the stimulus, you need your cortex. But to get that response of fear, you don't. You only need the amygdala. And so the idea here is that information is processed through both pathways, and you can have a faster response through the amygdala, which is good if it's a frightening stimulus. You want to respond as quickly as you can. But then the cortex actually works with the details, recognizes the object. And in some cases, the cortex may discover that the stimulus actually isn't that scary. Maybe it's a picture that can't hurt you. Or maybe the stimulus is not as frightening as it initially seemed. Maybe it's dark and you just couldn't tell what it was at first. And so this is what's referred to as down-regulating the amygdala. The cortex will put the brakes on the fear response and say, hey, wait, this is not that scary a situation after all. So the amygdala can have a quick response, but then after the cortex has a chance to fully process the stimulus, then it can either let the fear response stand, or it can downregulate the amygdala and diminish that fear response. But it takes a little longer. So that's another important process in the brain when it comes to regulating emotion, to responding to stimuli. You have this fast and this slow pathway. Okay, so we've talked about theories of emotion and emotions' role in physiological processes, emotions' role in the brain. And I'll shift gears a little bit here toward more psychological processes. And one of these processes is what's known as emotion regulation, which is our capacity to influence our own emotional experience, to control it to some degree. And there are different strategies for doing that. So one is simple behavioral strategies, things like not putting yourself in a situation where you're likely to experience an emotion that you want to avoid. So if you want to avoid being frightened, you don't want to go see scary movies. You don't want to go walking around in the woods at night. And so by avoiding those situations, you can affect your own emotional experience. Another common strategy that's actually not very effective is what's called suppression. And we've all done this. This is where we mitigate, we downplay, or we try to eliminate the outward signs of our emotional experience. So if we're sad, we try not to cry. If we are afraid, we try to calm down. We try to control our emotional expression on our face. It turns out that doesn't work very well in terms of actually changing our emotional experience. What's more effective is a process known as affect labeling, where if you actually verbally express, verbally describe what you are feeling, either aloud or by writing it down, that it can actually mitigate negative emotional states. Another process that people don't use nearly as much, even though it's quite effective, is what's known as cognitive reappraisal. Your book just calls it reappraisal, which is fine. But cognitive reappraisal is the process by which we reevaluate a stimulus and try to reframe it so that it's not in the same emotional context as our initial impression. So this figure here on the right is from an imaging study that was done on cognitive reappraisal. And what it shows are the areas of the brain that are more active when someone uses this strategy. So you get more activity in the prefrontal cortex when someone tries to reappraise an emotional stimulus. So in this experiment, it was things like seeing a picture of a woman crying at a funeral. And of course, that is going to invoke sadness in a lot of people. But they were then told to rethink of the situation, to think of the woman as being at a wedding crying, which is not nearly a sad situation. But it turns out that just reframing it that way also affected people's emotional experience. They didn't report being as sad. Uh, Other examples include if someone is acting hostile, that if you, rather than think of them as being angry, which is likely to produce anger in yourself, if you think of them as being afraid, right? They feel threatened, they feel afraid. And so that can impact your emotional response as well. As your book points out, there are some potential downsides here to cognitive reappraisal. And that is that sometimes you want those genuine emotional experiences, that maybe mitigating them or changing them in some way means you exhibit a different behavior that maybe is desirable. And so this is a study here we see here in the bottom left, where individuals were uh, confronted with a negative situation for another group of people. I believe it was the Darfur and Sudan tragedy. And they were asked how emotionally affected they were by reports of individuals in the situation. And not surprising, they report being sad or being worried. And one important factor here is the number of people that you're worrying about, the number of people that you're reading about as being victims. And it's a common phenomenon that you'll have a much bigger emotional response for one person if one person is in a bad situation or suffered a tragedy than if it's lots of people. And it turns out if you're not very good at regulating emotions, that that difference is not as big as if you're very good. If you're a very good emotional regulator, then you feel a normal amount of empathy for that one victim, but you feel much, much less as soon as it's a handful or 10 victims. That part of that effect of being a good emotional regulator is that you're also diminishing the empathy you feel for these large groups of people. So, potential negative side effect there. Another important part of our emotional experience, of course, is emotional expression. So, technically, an emotional expression is just any observable sign of an emotional state. And this can be something like behavior, so body language, the way we interact with other people, the way we walk, even. So there are sort of large-scale behaviors that can signal an emotional state. Certainly, voice intonation can signal an emotional state. So not just the choice of words, but how the pitch of someone's voice is modulated as they speak. And they've done experiments on this, and you can have two people giving the exact same words, uh, but if their emotional state is different, that can often be detected. Of course, the most famous and most really important is facial expression. That is the most common way that we assess someone else's emotional state is by seeing their facial expression. And you have a lot of muscles that underlie your face, and so you can uh, change the tension in all of those muscles to change your facial expression. Now, as we'll see, some of those muscles are more easily controlled voluntarily than others are. But facial expression is a very important way of signaling our emotional state. And this brings us to what's called the universality hypothesis, the idea that facial expressions are universal. So Darwin first expressed this idea, and part of that hypothesis was uh, that even animals have emotional states and have facial expressions that indicate those emotional states. So we, as humans, would have inherited uh, behavioral tendencies like facial expressions from our ancestors who had emotional states and emotional expressions. And there's evidence certainly for this. So the picture on the right, we see someone who's won an award and is smiling. And that might not be surprising, except that individual is actually blind, is congenitally blind, and has never seen someone smile before, and yet smiles when he's happy. And so that is obviously something that doesn't have to be learned by observation. Uh, to some degree, that is obviously innate. Uh, so that is part of the universality hypothesis, that our emotional expressions are tied to our emotional state at an evolutionary level. That it's not that we randomly pair certain behaviors with certain emotions. Otherwise, somebody crying could just as easily signal anger or happiness or fear as it does sadness. No, the idea is that certain behaviors like crying are correlated with certain emotional states evolutionarily. Now, your book makes it sound like this is totally accepted, totally proven for all of the major facial expressions. I should point out here that this is more controversial than your book makes it sound. They've done research on individuals from different cultures. So, emotional expression does have a cultural component. It is not that everyone expresses the same emotions the same way all across the world, so they can uh, have people try to recognize facial expressions if from a Western culture, if they're from a Eastern culture, or if they're from an indigenous culture that hasn't had contact with the Western world. And it turns out that some of these expressions seem to have a bigger cultural component than others. Things like happiness and sadness do seem to be pretty universal, but the jury is still sort of out on things like anger and disgust. That what the facial expression people tend to use for anger and disgust in our culture uh, may be different from certain indigenous cultures. And so when you're trying to recognize another culture's expressions, those are the ones, i.e., things like anger and disgust, that tend to be harder to recognize. That is, they are more culturally dependent. There's also what's called the facial feedback hypothesis, which is a very interesting one. The idea that not only do we use our facial muscles to indicate our facial expression, but that we also use facial muscles to assess our emotional state. There's sort of a closed loop. And there's a famous experiment that was done uh, where individuals weren't told explicitly to frown or to smile. Then you get into demand characteristics. They were told while they were doing a task to either hold a pencil in their teeth or to hold a pencil above their upper lip. And the thing is that doing that uh, actually makes one smile or frown, or at least use the same muscle groups involved in smiling and frowning. And after the task, people reported being happier if they held a pencil in their teeth and smiled versus holding the pencil above their upper lip and frowning. Again, it's not they were told to feel a certain way or even to smile or frown as an expression. Just having that emotional expression on one's face seems to influence an emotional state. Now, this finding is a little bit controversial also because they've had difficulty replicating that particular experiment. However, there is still some truth to it, it seems, especially when it comes to recognition of emotions, that expressing emotions and recognizing emotions are related processes. And so the effect of Botox, which of course is a cosmetic procedure that relaxes facial muscles, and people that have had Botox not only have difficulty expressing emotion facially, that part's not surprising. They've had the muscles affected directly by Botox. However, they also have difficulty feeling emotions. They do not feel emotions to the same extent that people who have not had Botox feel them. They also have more difficulty recognizing emotions in others. And the idea here is that we subtly and unconsciously mimic the facial expressions of others. And this is part of the facial feedback hypothesis. That when we see someone with emotional expression, if we create the same expression on our own face, it becomes easier to recognize. And so someone who's had Botox done cannot mimic that same facial expression and therefore has difficulty recognizing it. Also, the effect of brain damage, in particular amygdala damage. People with amygdala damage have a hard time recognizing certain facial expressions. So the brain has a role, but also the facial muscles have a role. So there's still some support for the facial feedback hypothesis. So that's how we express emotions and how we recognize expressions in others. But that brings us to the topic of deceptive expression, when our expression or that of others doesn't match the actual emotional state. And the point here is that we don't always want to communicate our emotions. Sometimes we want to hide our emotional state to some degree, especially when we're following what are known as display rules. And these tend to be very culturally dependent. But there are social situations in which emotional responses might be encouraged or discouraged, that we don't always respond the same way to different people, even given the same stimulus. So, for example, there's what's called intensification, where you exaggerate your true internal emotional state. I believe your book used the example of getting a gift that you're not very excited about, but you act excited. And I'm sure we've all done this, where in order to appear gracious, you act happier than you actually are. Uh, Also, if someone has made a transgression that isn't actually that upsetting to you, you might act more upset than you actually are in an effort to change their behavior, especially if you're a parent dealing with a child. Their behavior might not be that surprising or that upsetting, but sometimes you need to be stern to elicit a change in behavior on that part. There's also the opposite, de-intensification, where you diminish your emotional state. So maybe you're disappointed in someone, but you don't act that disappointed because you don't want to hurt their feelings. And so you can de-intensify your expression, uh, especially depending on who's going to be witnessing that emotional expression. Two other related concepts are what are called masking and neutralizing. Now, masking is when we're feeling one emotional state, but expressing a completely different one. So we may be afraid, but we instead express anger so as not to appear timid. And so there, we're not intensifying our emotional state or de-intensifying it. We're actually portraying an entirely different emotional state in order to disguise our true emotional one. There's also neutralizing, which is, as we see on the right here, a common practice if you're trying to hide your emotional state entirely. This is where you try to adopt a neutral expression. You try not to respond to an emotional stimulus. So here we have an example of a poker player, a very famous one, who is trying to adopt that classic poker face. So you can't tell if his cards are very good or if his cards are very bad. His expression is neutral. And so that is an example of neutralizing. And of course, all of these things depend on those display rules. They depend on the situation. This poker player probably doesn't have a neutral expression all the time. It's only when he's playing poker. And of course, display rules aren't the entire story. There are also uh, times when we want to appear sincere, but we're actually not. And so the difference between sincere and insincere expressions can often be detected. So we have a picture here in the lower right of two contestants in a beauty pageant. The one on the left happens to be Halle Berry, but the one on the right is just one. And there are subtle differences in their expressions. So they are both smiling with their mouths open, but the one on the right, the corners of her eyes are crinkled. The one on the left, her eyes are not. And so that gets into morphology, that is the shape of an expression, and what are called reliable muscles. Now, that's not to contrast with our muscles being unreliable. Our muscles generally do what we tell them. But the fact is that many of our muscle groups are hard for us to control. We don't have much control over those muscles that control the crinkling of the eyes. We have much more control over our mouths, which is why it's easy to adopt a smile, uh, but it can be hard to make that smile look genuine because you can't crinkle your eyes voluntarily, and that's part of a genuine smile. And so you have some muscles you can control, and some muscles you can't control so well. And so that can be the difference between a sincere and an insincere display. Also, symmetry. Sincere facial expressions tend to be symmetrical. Insincere ones, where you have to exert voluntary control over your muscles, tend to have less symmetry. So that can be a giveaway. Of course, there are emotional expressions that are, by their nature, asymmetrical. Things like smirks. A smirk is asymmetrical. Uh, a wink is asymmetrical by its nature. But for things like smiles uh, that tend to be symmetrical, if it's insincere, it may not be so. There's also a matter of timing. So genuine expressions uh, tend to not last as long. That's what's called duration. Uh, and and so if they don't last as long, they tend to be genuine. Whereas people that are faking an expression or forcing it, that expression tends to stick around longer. On a related note, there's what's called temporal patterning. Uh, Genuine expressions take a little while to be exhibited on the face, and they take a little while to go away. They tend to gradually transition into an expression and away from an expression. Whereas an insincere display tends to have a very sudden onset and a very sudden offset. Someone will suddenly smile instantly, and that smile will go away just as quickly. And that's a good clue that it's not a sincere display. And so these are ways we can detect deception in facial expression, but of course there's more to deception than just the expression on someone's face. So when someone is lying, how do we tell? How good are we at detecting when someone is lying? The answer is not very good. Especially because a lot of the clues that we think tell us that someone's lying actually tell us the opposite. So people tend to speak more quickly, with more detail, when they're telling the truth, whereas people speak simply and slower when they are lying. This is not, of course, a hard and fast rule. This is just a tendency. But many people think the opposite is true. So that makes it hard to detect lies. Of course, we have machines that try to detect lies in speech. And these are what are often known as polygraph tests, where you measure someone's physiology. So this gets back to the role of physiology in emotional expression and emotional state. And polygraphs check things like the galvanic skin response, which is the amount of sweat in small amounts on the skin, or heart rate, or breathing rate. These things can all be indicators, and polygraphs do a little better than just your average human being at telling if someone is lying, but they still have a very large error rate. It's one of the reasons they're not admissible evidence. Um, and the fact is that their error rate is large enough that we shouldn't really trust polygraph tests. You can also be trained to fool a polygraph test. So we're still waiting for a really good method for detecting lies in individuals. Okay, that will do it for this lecture. Next time, we'll look at motivation, which is related to emotional state, but it's about why we do the things we do. And of course, motivation research has its own history, so we'll talk a little bit about that, about how people have approached this problem of why people behave the way they do. We'll look at some of the reasons, some of the motivations behind behavior are to satisfy biological needs. So we all need to find food to survive. We all need a mate to survive in the Darwinian sense, to reproduce. So we'll talk about eating and sexual behavior as biological motivations. And then we'll move on to more psychological motivations, whether we're aware of motivation or not, whether we're motivated by an inner drive, so to speak, an inner desire to make accomplishments, or whether we're motivated by something extrinsic, some reward we're going to get if we behave a certain way. So we'll talk about all those things next time, and I will see you then.